Following World War II, the US and Soviets entered a period of heightened tension known as the Cold War. Each superpower was trying to prove their political ideology as superior. For America, that ideology was democracy, the Soviets, communism. At first, the US's Cold War policy consisted of giving money to struggling countries to prevent them from adopting communism, but this soon changed after the Soviets detonated an atomic bomb. This was the Soviets' first real showing of power, and they soon made their intentions clear when North Korea invaded the South using Soviet tanks. Where their soaring begins, however, comes at the end of the Korean War. Returning POWs portrayed unusual behavior, leading to speculation that their minds had been tampered with. For instance, there are cases where some soldiers were reportedly so brainwashed that they refused to return to the U.S. Furthermore, the New York Times released an article affirming that American POWs had been converted by communist brainwashers. In a speech in regards to this, Allen Dulles, director of the CIA from 1953 to 1961, referred to this as brain warfare. He called these tactics abhorrent and antithetical to American values, but in just 3 days after his speech, Dulles approved of a top-secret program called MKUltra to try to learn how to harness this ability.
Project MKUltra began in the 50s and was ultimately an attempt by the CIA to try to learn how to reprogram the human mind. Chemist Sidney Gottlieb ran this experiment, and under his supervision, various techniques such as electroshock therapy, hypnosis, radiation, and a variety of other drugs and toxins, most notably lysergic acid diethylamide, better known as LSD, were experimented with. The CIA believed that LSD could be useful in interrogations by essentially making the person in question lose all of their free will. In fact, they believed LSD to be so useful that they bought out the world's supply for $240,000. The LSD was then distributed out to hospitals, prisons, and universities so that they could conduct research projects to learn more about the drug and how people reacted to it. Some people voluntarily took the drug, some were fellow CIA employees whose coffee had been spiked, while others, like Boston's very own notorious crime boss James Joseph Whitey Bulger, were coerced into doing so. Prisoners like Bulger were especially vulnerable because they were willing to give their consent in return for more recreation time or commuted sentences. Bulger was told that he was participating in an experiment to find a cure for schizophrenia and was given LSD every day for more than a year. Years later, Bulger wrote, "I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me." The last form of subjects, however, did not give their consent. In fact, they had no idea they were participating in an experiment at all. The most notorious example of this was
Operation Midnight Climax.
During this operation, George Hunter White, who had previously worked for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was in charge of decorating a room. Why? Because he was building a trap in which White was seated behind a two-way mirror, sipping margaritas while government-hired prostitutes lured unsuspecting men into the room, giving them drinks spiked with LSD.
In many ways, Project MKUltra was a continuation of the atrocities committed in German and Japanese concentration camps. The CIA actually hired Japanese and Nazi scientists to explain what they had found out so that they could build upon their research. For instance, the Nazis experimented a lot with the drug mescaline, which is a psychedelic comparable to LSD, and they hired Nazis who had been involved in those experiments to advise them. The irony of the situation was that the US started this project as a means to protect American values from communists, but in doing so, we strayed away from our original cause. But perhaps even more antithetical to American values was what the CIA did overseas. Overseas, Gottlieb did not have to worry about any legal entanglements that he would in the US, and so scattered all around Europe and Asia were American detention centers, where the CIA would capture and detain enemy agents who in their eyes were expendable, and conduct experiments to learn how to break the human mind so that it could be reprogrammed.
The most notable effect that this project had on American society was that of counterculture. This was an anti-establishment movement popular between the mid-1960s and mid-1970s. Centered around the white middle-class youth, the basis of this movement was the rejection of societal norms such as racial segregation, women's rights, materialism, and most popularly, the rejection of the Vietnam War. This rejection was present in many forms, such as communitarian experiments, sexual liberation, and unconventional appearance in music, highlighted by Robert Hunter, lead singer of the popular rock band Grateful Dead, who was seen as a cultural leader for hippies, the followers of this movement. Hunter was also an avid user of LSD, stemming from his voluntary participation in government experiments using this drug. The influx of psychedelic drugs, such as LSD, into the United States for the purpose of CIA mind control experiments made these much more accessible to the public. Many people who volunteered to be experimented on found LSD to be quite pleasurable, and thus it spread around America. In attempts to prove their anti-establishment support, hippies popularized these drugs for recreational use, especially among the American youth. LSD was very plentiful in America at the time, given the large amounts of it imported into the United States for use in Project MKUltra. This led to the growth in this movement, as these drugs were a key way to unite its followers. Since it had only been used for government purposes so far, these psychedelic drugs were not yet criminalized, meaning that not only was it abundant, but there was also no penalty or punishment for using this, making the movement that much more popular. This also created a sense of irony, since a drug that was originally being experimented on for the purpose of controlling minds was later seen as a symbol of government distrust and rebellion. It wasn't until the government began cracking down on these drugs in the late 60s, labeling them as Schedule 1, that these counterculture movements began to fizzle out. This would inevitably have an effect on how drugs in general were viewed by both the American public and the federal government, which can be seen as fuel for the future war on drugs beginning in the early 1970s.
The CIA experimented with LSD until 1963 when John Vance, a member of the CIA Inspector General's staff, learned about the project's surreptitious nature in which they conducted their experiments. The Inspector General told the agency that they could no longer perform the experiments on unwitting subjects, and the project slowly came to an end. Moreover, LSD was concluded to be incapable of producing the results that they were looking for, as it was too unpredictable. Gottlieb's career came to an end in 1973 after the CIA director Richard Helms was removed by President Nixon. As a result, both men agreed to destroy all records of Project MKUltra. Only a hodgepodge of papers remained afterwards, which were later pieced together in what we know today. It's impossible to know what other atrocities were lost within those files, but it's safe to say that many lives, both American and foreign, were lost as a result.
Although some may have seen the research necessary for the security of the nation, the CIA undoubtedly abused their power. One of the only people who oversaw Gottlieb was his boss, Richard Helms, and the CIA director, Dulles, but neither of them really wanted to know what he was doing, essentially giving Gottlieb a license to kill. Moreover, the fact that some experiments had to be conducted overseas adds to the fact that what they were doing was clearly illegal. The fact that Gottlieb chose to burn the archives exemplifies the conscious abuse of power that took place during this project. Although it is likely that the public will never again be aware of such an abuse of power as seen here, if we do, we must hold those responsible accountable so as to maintain American values.